The stagecoach rattled into Jamestown, Montana Territory on a blistering August afternoon in 1882, and Florence Thompson pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window, her heart hammering so hard she wondered if the other passengers could hear it. She was 42 years old, and she had lied about her age in every single letter she had written to Preston Hall over the past 6 months. The advertisement had been clear. Rancher seeking a wife, preferably between 25 and 35, to help manage a growing cattle operation and provide companionship in the remote Montana wilderness. Florence had written back anyway, shaving 8 years off her true age and praying that desperation would not show through her careful penmanship. She had nothing left in Philadelphia except debts from her late husband's gambling and a boarding house room she could no longer afford. The choice had been simple: lie and hope for mercy, or starve with her pride intact. Now, as the stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weathered general store, Florence caught sight of a tall man standing beside a wagon. He wore a brown hat that shaded his face, but she could see the strong line of his jaw and the breadth of his shoulders. Preston Hall. It had to be him. He was scanning each passenger as they disembarked, clearly searching for someone, and Florence felt her stomach twist into knots so tight she thought she might be sick right there on the coach floor. The driver opened the door and offered his hand. Florence took it, her legs trembling as she stepped down onto the dusty street. She smoothed her green traveling dress, acutely aware of how the fabric pulled slightly at her waist where she had let it out twice over the years. Her dark hair, threaded with more silver than she cared to admit, was pinned neatly beneath her hat, and she had applied just enough powder that morning to hide the lines around her eyes. Not enough to look painted, just enough to hope. "Mrs. Thompson." The voice was deep and warm, and Florence turned to find Preston Hall standing just a few feet away. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had imagined. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the ends and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. His face was weathered from years outdoors, but he could not have been more than 38 or 40 himself, young enough that her deception suddenly felt even more shameful. "Mr. Hall," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I am Florence Thompson." He removed his hat and held it against his chest, his gaze moving over her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. She saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in his eyes. His expression flickered, just for a second, and Florence felt her heart plummet. He knew. Of course he knew. She looked nothing like the woman he had been expecting. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, and Florence forced herself to speak before her courage failed entirely. "I understand if you wish to send me back on the next stage. I will not blame you. I was not entirely truthful in my letters about my age, and I apologize for wasting your time and money." Preston stood very still, his hat still held against his chest, and then something shifted in his face. The surprise faded, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. "How old are you really?" 42. The number fell from her lips like a stone into still water. "And you thought I would care about that?" Florence blinked, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon." Preston stepped closer, close enough that she could smell leather and sage and something clean like soap. His eyes were kind, she realized. Kind and tired and perhaps a little lonely, just as hers probably were. "Age is just a number," he said quietly so only she could hear. "You are stunning." The words hit her like a physical blow, and Florence felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. No one had called her stunning in more than a decade. No one had looked at her the way Preston Hall was looking at her now, as if she were something precious that he was afraid might disappear if he blinked too hard. "I do not understand," she whispered. I expected someone younger. That is true, Preston admitted, his voice still low and gentle. But I also expected someone who might look at me as a means to an end, a way out of whatever trouble brought her west. You look terrified right now, Mrs. Thompson, and that tells me you actually care what I think. That tells me you are honest enough to offer me the choice to send you back. Most women would have stepped off that coach and pretended nothing was amiss. Most women would not have lied in the first place, Florence said, shame burning in her chest. Most women have not been desperate enough to need to lie, Preston countered. He placed his hat back on his head and offered her his arm. My wagon is just here. I would be honored if you would allow me to drive you out to the ranch. We can talk more there, and if you still wish to leave after you have seen the place and rested from your journey, I will bring you back to town myself. No questions asked. Fair enough. Florence stared at his offered arm, her mind reeling. This was not how this was supposed to go. She had prepared herself for anger, for accusations of fraud, for being sent away in disgrace. She had not prepared herself for kindness, for understanding, for a man who looked at her with warmth in his eyes and called her stunning when she felt anything but, slowly, she placed her hand on his arm. Fair enough. The ride out to the ranch took nearly an hour, and Florence spent most of it in stunned silence, watching the landscape roll past. Montana territory was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that made her chest ache. Mountains rose in the distance like ancient sentinels, their peaks still touched with snow even in August. The grasslands stretched out in every direction, golden and rippling in the breeze, and she saw cattle grazing in the distance, their dark shapes dotting the horizon. Preston drove the wagon with easy competence, his hands steady on the reins. He did not push her to talk, seeming content with the quiet, and Florence found herself grateful for the reprieve. Her thoughts were a chaotic tangle, and she needed time to sort through them. Finally, as they crested a low rise, Preston pointed ahead. There. That is home. The ranch house came into view, and Florence felt her breath catch. It was larger than she had expected, a sturdy two-story structure built from honey-colored logs with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Outbuildings dotted the property, including a large barn, a chicken coop, and what looked like a bunkhouse. Smoke curled from the chimney, and she could see a woman standing on the porch, shading her eyes against the sun as she watched their approach. That is Maria, Preston explained. She cooks for the ranch hands and keeps the house in order. She has been with me since I first built this place 5 years ago. Her husband, Carlos, is my foreman. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and Maria hurried down the steps. She was a small, round woman with dark hair streaked with gray and a smile that lit up her entire face. Senor Preston, you are back, and this must be the bride, yes. This is Mrs. Florence Thompson, Preston said, climbing down from the wagon and then turning to help Florence. His hands were strong and sure as he lifted her down, and Florence felt a flutter in her stomach that she had not experienced in years. Maria took both of Florence's hands in hers and squeezed them warmly. Welcome, welcome. You must be so tired from your journey. Come, I have prepared a room for you upstairs. Senor Preston said you would want your own space until the wedding, yes. Florence glanced at Preston, who nodded slightly. I thought you might appreciate some privacy while we get to know each other properly, he said. There is no rush for anything. We can take our time. Thank you, Florence managed, overwhelmed by the continued kindness. This man owed her nothing, and yet he was treating her with a gentleness that made her want to weep. Maria led her inside, chattering happily about the house and the ranch as they climbed the stairs. The room she showed Florence to was simple but clean, with a large bed covered in a handmade quilt, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the grasslands. It was more than Florence had dared to hope for. "I will bring you some water to wash," Maria said. "And then you must come down for supper. I have made my famous beef stew and there is fresh bread. You will love it, I promise." After Maria left, Florence sank down onto the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came hot and fast, born of relief and confusion and a hope so fragile she was afraid to examine it too closely. She had been so certain this would end in disaster, and instead she had been met with grace. When she had composed herself, she washed her face and changed into a fresh dress, a simple blue cotton that was one of her nicest. Her hands shook as she repinned her hair, and she took several deep breaths before heading downstairs. The dining room was warm and inviting, with a long wooden table that could easily seat a dozen people. Preston was already seated at the head of the table, and he stood when she entered, pulling out a chair for her. "I hope the room is satisfactory." "It is more than satisfactory," Florence said, settling into the chair. "It is lovely. This entire place is lovely." Preston smiled, and the expression transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. "I am glad you think so. I know it is not Philadelphia. It is rough out here and the work is hard, but there is a freedom in it that I have never found anywhere else." Maria bustled in with bowls of stew and a basket of bread, and the smell made Florence's mouth water. She had not realized how hungry she was until that moment. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, and then Preston set down his spoon and looked at her seriously. "I want to be honest with you, Florence. May I call you Florence?" "Of course." "I want to be honest about why I sent for a mail-order bride in the first place," he continued. "I was married before. Her name was Margaret, and she died 3 years ago giving birth to our daughter, who also did not survive. I loved her very much, and for a long time I thought I would never want to marry again. But this ranch is growing, and I found myself lonely in a way that work could not fix. I do not expect you to replace Margaret. I do not expect you to love me right away or perhaps ever. But I do hope that we can build something good together, a partnership at the very least." "Does that sound like something you might want?" Florence set down her own spoon, her throat tight with emotion. "I was married before as well. My husband Thomas died 2 years ago. He was a good man in many ways, but he had a fondness for cards and whiskey that eventually consumed him. He left me with nothing but debts, and I have been working as a seamstress to survive. When I saw your advertisement, I thought it might be my only chance at a new life. I did not lie about my age to deceive you out of malice. I lied because I was terrified that the truth would disqualify me before I even had a chance. I understand now that was wrong, and I am sorrier than I can say." Preston reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch sent a shock of warmth up her arm. "You have nothing to apologize for. Desperation makes us all do things we would not otherwise do. What matters is what we do from here. So I will ask you plainly, do you want to stay? Do you want to try to make this work?" Florence looked into his eyes, those warm, whiskey-colored eyes, and felt something inside her shift and settle. "Yes," she said, "I want to stay." The smile that broke across Preston's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Then stay. Stay as long as you like. We can be married when you are ready, and not a moment before." They finished their meal talking about small things, safe things. Preston told her about the ranch, about the herd of cattle he was building, about his plans to expand in the coming years. Florence told him about Philadelphia, about her work as a seamstress, about the friends she had left behind. It was easy, this conversation, easier than Florence had expected, and by the time Maria cleared the dishes away, she felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. That night, Lying in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room, Florence stared up at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the day. She had traveled 1,000 miles expecting rejection and had instead found acceptance. She had braced herself for anger and had been met with kindness. Preston Hall was not what she had expected, and that realization filled her with a cautious, fragile hope. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Florence woke early each morning to help Maria in the kitchen, learning to cook for a ranch full of hungry men. There were 6 hands besides Carlo's, all of them young and polite and clearly curious about the new woman in the house. Preston was up before dawn each day, working alongside his men, and Florence found herself watching for him through the kitchen window, her heart doing a strange little skip whenever she caught sight of him. In the evenings after supper, Preston would walk with her around the property. He showed her the vegetable garden that Maria tended, the chicken coop where fat hens clucked and pecked at the ground, the barn where horses stamped and whickered in their stalls. He told her stories about the land, about the harsh winters and the blazing summers, about the challenges of building something from nothing. And Florence listened, fascinated by this man who had carved out a life in the wilderness. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, they walked farther than usual, following a path that led to a small creek. The water burbled over smooth stones, and wildflowers grew in profusion along the banks. Preston led her to a flat rock near the water's edge, and they sat, the evening sun painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "This is my favorite spot on the entire ranch," Preston said quietly. "When things get difficult, I come here to think." Florence picked a wildflower and twirled it between her fingers. "It is beautiful, peaceful. Florence, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Preston turned to face her, his expression serious. "Are you happy here, truly happy?" The question caught her off guard, and Florence took a moment to consider her answer. Was she happy? She thought about the past 2 weeks, about the laughter in the kitchen with Maria, about the satisfaction of learning new skills, about the quiet pleasure of Preston's company. She thought about how she fell asleep each night without the gnawing worry that had plagued her in Philadelphia, about how she woke each morning with a sense of purpose. "Yes," she said finally, "I am happy here, happier than I have been in a very long time." Preston reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. The gesture was intimate and tender, and Florence felt her pulse quicken. "I am happy too, happier than I thought I could be again. You have brought life back to this place, Florence, to me. And I find myself thinking about you constantly, wondering what you are doing, if you are smiling, if you might possibly feel even a fraction of what I am beginning to feel for you." Florence's breath caught. "And what is it you are beginning to feel?" "That I am falling in love with you," Preston said simply. "I know it has only been 2 weeks. I know we agreed to take things slowly, but I cannot deny what is in my heart. You are kind and strong and beautiful, and I want to build a life with you. A real life. Not just a partnership, but a marriage in every sense of the word. If you will have me." Tears welled in Florence's eyes, blurring her vision. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I did not think I could feel this way again. I thought that part of my life was over. But you have shown me such kindness, Preston, such patience, and I find that I am falling in love with you as well." Preston cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Then marry me, Florence. Marry me not because you need a home or because I need a wife, but because we choose each other, because we want to." "Yes," Florence said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Florence felt something inside her heart crack open and bloom. It was a kiss full of promise, full of hope, and when they finally pulled apart, she was smiling through her tears. They were married a week later in the small church in Jamestown, with Maria and Carlos as witnesses and the minister's wife playing a slightly out-of-tune piano. Florence wore a new dress that Maria had helped her sew, a simple cream-colored gown with lace at the collar and cuffs. Preston wore his best suit, and when he looked at her as she walked down the aisle, Florence saw such love in his eyes that she felt her knees go weak. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. The small gathering cheered, and Maria wiped happy tears from her eyes. That night, as Florence stood in Preston's bedroom, now their bedroom, she felt nervousness flutter in her stomach. It had been years since she had been with a man, and she was acutely aware of every line and imperfection on her body. But when Preston came to her, his eyes were full of love and desire, and he touched her as if she were made of something precious. "You are so beautiful," he murmured against her skin, and Florence believed him because the way he looked at her made her feel beautiful. Their lovemaking was slow and tender, a careful exploration of each other. Preston was patient and gentle, and Florence found herself responding to him in ways she had not expected, her body remembering pleasures she had thought long forgotten. Afterward, they lay tangled together, and Preston traced lazy patterns on her shoulder with his fingertips. "I love you," he said quietly. "I love you too," Florence replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Florence's life. She threw herself into her new role as Preston's wife and partner, learning the rhythms of ranch life. She helped Maria with the cooking and cleaning, tended the vegetable garden, gathered eggs from the chickens, and even learned to ride a horse, though she never felt quite comfortable in the saddle. Preston was a wonderful husband, attentive and affectionate. He made her laugh with his dry humor, and he listened when she talked about her hopes and fears. They fell into the habit of sitting together on the porch each evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, and those quiet moments became Florence's favorite part of the day. Winter came hard and fast that year, blanketing the ranch in snow and bringing temperatures so cold that the water in the wash basin froze solid overnight. Florence had never experienced a winter like it, and there were days when she thought she might never be warm again. But the ranch hands kept the fires burning, and Preston held her close at night, his body a furnace against her back. It was in late January, during a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow, that Florence realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she dismissed it as a symptom of her age. She was 42, after all, and it was not uncommon for women her age to become irregular. But when another month passed and she still had not bled, and when she found herself feeling nauseated each morning, she began to wonder. She confided in Maria, who looked at her with knowing eyes and a gentle smile. "I think perhaps you are with child, Senora." "But I am too old," Florence protested, even as hope and fear warred in her chest. "I am 42 years old." "My mother had my youngest brother when she was 44, Maria said. "It is not common, but it is not impossible. You should tell Senor Preston." That evening, after supper, Florence asked Preston to walk with her despite the cold. They bundled up in heavy coats and scarves and made their way to the barn, where it was warmer and more private. "Is something wrong?" Preston asked, concern creasing his brow. "No, nothing is wrong," Florence said quickly. "At least, I do not think anything is wrong." "I am not entirely sure how you will feel about it. Florence, you are frightening me. Please just tell me." She took a deep breath and met his eyes. "I think I might be with child." Preston stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Florence felt her heart sink. Perhaps he did not want children. Perhaps he thought her too old. Perhaps this would be the thing that finally made him regret choosing her, And then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, and Florence found herself laughing too, relief flooding through her. "A baby," he said, setting her down and cupping her face in his hands. "We are going to have a baby. Florence, this is the best news you could have given me. I thought after Margaret and the baby died that I would never have the chance to be a father. And now you are giving me that chance. You are giving me everything." Florence's eyes filled with tears, happy tears this time. "You are not upset that I am too old, too old. Florence, you are perfect. This baby is perfect. Everything is perfect." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Florence felt joy bubble up inside her like champagne. The pregnancy was not easy. Florence was sick, almost every day for the first few months, and there were times when she wondered if her body could withstand the strain. But Maria took excellent care of her, making sure she ate properly and rested when she needed to, and Preston was endlessly patient, holding her hair back when she was sick and rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings. As her belly grew, so did Preston's excitement. He built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it until the wood was smooth as silk. He spoke to the baby through Florence's stomach, telling stories and singing off key lullabies that made Florence laugh. And he treated her with such tenderness that she sometimes felt overwhelmed by the depth of his love. In early September, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air carried a hint of autumn, Florence went into labor. It started as a low ache in her back and quickly intensified into waves of pain that took her breath away. Maria sent one of the ranch hands to fetch the midwife from town, and Preston stayed by Florence's side, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. The labor lasted nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Florence thought she might not survive it. She was not a young woman, and childbirth was dangerous even for those who were. But the midwife was skilled, and Maria was there to help, and Preston never left her side, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of pain. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set, Florence gave one last mighty push and felt the baby slip free. The midwife caught the infant, and there was a moment of terrible silence, and then a thin, reedy cry filled the room. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant on Florence's chest. "A healthy baby boy." Florence looked down at her son, at his red, wrinkled face and his tiny fists, and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. Preston was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he gazed at his son. "He is perfect," Preston whispered. "You are perfect. Florence, you have given me the world." They named him William Thomas Hall, after Preston's father and Florence's late husband, and he was indeed perfect. He had a thatch of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same whiskey brown as his father's. He was a good baby, only crying when he was hungry or needed changing, and he seemed to bring joy to everyone who met him. The ranch hands took turns peeking in at him, their rough faces softening at the sight of the tiny infant. Maria knitted him blankets and hats and tiny booties. And Preston was besotted, spending hours just watching William sleep, marveling at his small fingers and toes. Florence recovered slowly from the birth, her body aching and exhausted, but she had never been happier. She spent her days nursing William, singing to him, learning his cries and his needs. And in the evenings, Preston would take the baby so she could rest, walking him around the room and talking to him in that low, gentle voice that made Florence's heart melt. Winter came again, and then spring, and William grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby. He learned to roll over, then to sit up, then to crawl with impressive speed across the floor. Preston baby proofed the house as best he could. moving anything fragile out of reach, and Florence found herself constantly chasing after their adventurous son. On their second wedding anniversary, Preston surprised her with a picnic by the creek. Maria watched William for the afternoon, and Preston and Florence rode out together, the spring sunshine warm on their faces. They spread a blanket on the same flat rock where he had first told her he was falling in love with her, and they ate bread and cheese and drank cool water from the creek. "Do you remember the day you arrived?" Preston asked, lying back on the blanket and pulling Florence down beside him. "You looked so terrified stepping off that stagecoach." "I was terrified," Florence admitted. "I was certain you would send me away the moment you saw me." "I almost could not believe my luck when I saw you," Preston said. "I had been expecting some young girl who would look at me as a meal ticket. Instead, I got a woman. A real woman, with life and experience and strength written all over her face. I knew the moment I looked at you that I wanted to know everything about you." Florence turned on her side to face him, propping her head on her hand. "You told me age was just a number and that I was stunning. No one had ever said anything like that to me before." "I meant every word," Preston said, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "And I mean it even more now. You are the most beautiful woman I have ever known, Florence, not just because of how you look, but because of who you are. You are kind and brave, and you gave me a son when I thought I would never have a child. You saved me from a lonely life, and I thank God every day that you answered my advertisement." "I love you," Florence whispered, her eyes shining with tears. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes." "Then we will be frightened together," Preston said, pulling her down for a kiss. The years passed in a blur of happiness. William grew into a bright, energetic boy with his father's smile and his mother's determination. Preston expanded the ranch, adding more cattle and more land, and the operation became one of the most successful in the territory. Florence took over the bookkeeping, her neat hand recording every transaction, every head of cattle, every expense and profit. She discovered she had a head for numbers, and Preston came to rely on her judgment in business matters. They added on to the house, building a larger kitchen and a proper parlor, and Florence filled the rooms with touches of home. Curtains she sewed herself, quilts pieced together during long winter evenings, wildflowers in vases on every table. The ranch became a real home, filled with laughter and love. When William was 4, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. She was 47 years old, and the doctor in Jamestown warned her of the risks, but Florence was determined. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and when she went into labor on a warm June evening, she delivered a healthy baby girl with minimal fuss. They named her Margaret Rose, after Preston's first wife and Florence's favorite flower, and she was a tiny, delicate thing with blonde hair and blue eyes. William was enchanted with his baby sister, always wanting to hold her and help take care of her, and Preston walked around with a permanent grin on his face. "2 children," he said one night, watching Margaret sleep in her cradle while William curled up between them in bed. "I never thought I would be this blessed." "Neither did I," Florence said, her heart full to bursting. As the children grew, the ranch continued to prosper. Montana became a state in 1889, and Jamestown grew from a small frontier town into a thriving community. Preston was elected to the town council, and Florence started a women's auxiliary that raised money for a new school. They became pillars of the community, respected and admired, but they never forgot where they had come from or the unlikely love story that had brought them together. William grew into a tall, strong boy who loved the ranch and everything about it. He followed his father everywhere, learning to rope and ride and work cattle. Margaret was quieter, more bookish, and she spent hours reading in the parlor or helping Florence in the garden. They were as different as night and day, but they adored each other, and the house rang with their laughter and occasional arguments. When Florence turned 55, Preston threw her a birthday party that half the county attended. There was music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. And as Florence looked around at the faces of friends and neighbors, at her children laughing and playing, at her husband watching her with love in his eyes, she felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Preston found her later, standing on the porch and looking out at the sunset. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head. "Happy birthday, my love." "Thank you," Florence said, leaning back against him. "This has been a perfect day." "Do you ever regret it?" Preston asked quietly. "Leaving Philadelphia, coming all this way to marry a stranger." Florence turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered, beloved face. "Not for a single moment. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible, Preston. You gave me love and family and a home. You looked at me when I was broken and afraid, and you told me I was stunning. You saw me when I thought I was invisible. How could I ever regret that?" Preston kissed her, slow and sweet, and Florence felt the same flutter in her stomach that she had felt that first day in Jamestown, stepping off the stagecoach and into her new life. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both big and small. William went off to college in Bozeman, studying agriculture and business, but he always came home for holidays and summers, eager to help with the ranch. Margaret developed a talent for painting, and her watercolors of the Montana landscape began to sell in galleries back east. She married a young schoolteacher when she was 21, a kind man named David who loved her fiercely and treated her like precious treasure. Preston's hair turned completely gray, and Florence's grew white as snow, but they still took their evening walks around the property, still sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Their love had deepened over the years, becoming something solid and unshakable, a foundation upon which they had built an entire life. When Preston turned 65, he began to slow down, leaving more of the day-to-day ranch operations to William, who had returned home after college and taken over as foreman. Preston still rode out most mornings, but he would come back earlier, content to spend afternoons with Florence in the garden or reading in the parlor. One evening, as they sat on the porch in their favorite rocking chairs, Florence reached over and took Preston's hand. They had been married for nearly 30 years, and she knew every line on his face, every scar on his hands, every expression that crossed his features. "You remember what you said to me the day I arrived?" she asked. Preston squeezed her hand, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "I said a lot of things that day. You said age is just a number and that I was stunning. And I meant it. I still mean it. You are still the most stunning woman I have ever known, Florence Hall. We have built a good life, have we not?" "The best life," Preston agreed. "Better than I ever could have imagined. You took a chance on a lonely rancher and you gave me everything I never knew I needed. Our children, this home, your love. I am the luckiest man alive." Florence felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were happy tears, tears of joy and contentment. "And I am the luckiest woman. I thought my life was over when I stepped on that stagecoach. I thought I was too old, too worn down by life to ever be happy again. But you showed me that it is never too late for love, never too late for a new beginning." They sat in companionable silence as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. The ranch stretched out before them, golden in the fading light, and Florence could see their grandchildren playing in the yard, William's 2 boys and Margaret's little girl, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. This was her legacy, Florence thought. Not just the children and grandchildren, but this love, this partnership, this life they had built together from nothing but hope and faith and a willingness to take a chance on each other. She had been terrified that day in Jamestown, certain that her lie about her age would doom her to rejection and shame. Instead, she had found a man who looked past the numbers to see the woman beneath. A man who valued her for who she was, not how old she was. Preston stood and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet. "Dance with me." "There is no music," Florence protested, but she was already moving into his arms. "We do not need music," Preston said, and he began to sway with her, humming an old tune under his breath. They danced on the porch as the stars began to appear overhead. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful. Florence rested her head on Preston's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt a peace so complete it was like coming home after a long journey. Inside the house, Maria was preparing supper, and the smell of roasting meat drifted out through the open windows. The grandchildren's laughter grew louder as William called them in to wash up for dinner. Margaret and David would be arriving soon, and the house would be full of noise and love and life. "I love you," Florence whispered against Preston's chest. "I love you too," Preston replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Until my last breath and beyond." They stopped dancing but remained standing there, wrapped in each other's arms, and Florence thought about all the moments that had led them to this one. The desperate advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper. The lies she had told out of fear and desperation. The terror she had felt stepping off that stagecoach, and then Preston's words, kind and accepting, offering her a grace she had not deserved but had desperately needed. "Age is just a number." "You are stunning." Those words had changed everything. They had given her permission to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved a second chance at happiness. And Preston had proven those words true every single day since, loving her without reservation, building a life with her that exceeded her wildest dreams. "Come on," Preston said, taking her hand. "Let us go see our family." They walked into the house together, hand in hand, and were immediately engulfed by grandchildren demanding attention and hugs. William grinned at them from across the room, and Maria called out that dinner would be ready in 10 minutes. The house was warm and bright and filled with love, and Florence felt her heart swell with gratitude. This was what she had traveled all those miles for, though she had not known it at the time. Not just a home or security, but this. A family, a legacy, a love that had started with a chance meeting and grown into something eternal. That night, after everyone had gone home and the grandchildren had been tucked into bed in the guest rooms, Florence and Preston lay together in the darkness of their bedroom. Preston's arm was around her, and Florence rested her head on his shoulder, listening to him breathe. "Preston," she said softly. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me, not my age or my mistakes or my fears, but me." Preston's arm tightened around her. "Thank you for being brave enough to step off that stagecoach. Thank you for trusting me with your heart. Thank you for every day we have had together, and every day we will have in the future." Florence tilted her head up and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into that kiss. And when they finally pulled apart, she settled back against his shoulder with a contented sigh. She drifted off to sleep thinking about the future, about the years still to come. William would continue to build the ranch, expanding it for future generations. Margaret would continue to paint, capturing the beauty of Montana on canvas. The grandchildren would grow and have children of their own, and the Hall family would continue to thrive in this wild, beautiful place. And through it all, she and Preston would be together. their love the foundation upon which everything else was built. They had started as strangers, two lonely people looking for companionship, and they had become partners, lovers, best friends. They had weathered storms both literal and figurative, had celebrated triumphs and mourned losses, and had come through it all stronger and more united. The months turned into years, and Preston and Florence grew older together with grace and humor. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch had become a true family legacy, with William running it alongside his sons, and there were talks of expanding even further into sheep ranching. Preston's health began to decline when he was 70, his joints stiff with arthritis and his breathing sometimes labored. But he remained cheerful, joking that he had lived a fuller life than most men could dream of, and he had no complaints. Florence took care of him with the same tenderness he had always shown her, making sure he took his medicine and did not overexert himself. One spring morning, when the wildflowers were blooming and the air smelled of grass and possibility, Preston asked Florence to walk with him to the creek one more time. It was difficult for him to walk that far now, but he was determined, and Florence supported him as they made their slow way along the familiar path. They sat on the flat rock where he had first told her he was falling in love with her, and they watched the water burble over the stones just as it had done all those years ago. The world had changed so much since that day, but this place remained constant, a touchstone of memory and love. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" Preston asked, his voice thin but warm. "Of course I remember," Florence said, squeezing his hand. "You told me you were falling in love with me, and I told you I felt the same way." "Best decision I ever made, falling in love with you," Preston said. "I have had a good life, Florence, a very good life, and it is all because you said yes." "We both said yes," Florence corrected gently. "We chose each other." "That we did," Preston agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I am not afraid of dying, you know. I have lived more than I ever expected to, loved more than I thought possible. My only regret is that I will have to leave you." Florence felt tears slide down her cheeks, but she did not try to stop them. "Do not talk like that. You still have years ahead of you." "Maybe," Preston said. "Maybe not. But either way, I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. You took a broken, lonely man and you made him whole again. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. I could not have asked for anything more." "I love you," Florence whispered, her voice breaking. "I have loved you from almost the first moment I met you, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Preston said. He turned to look at her, his eyes still that warm, whiskey brown despite his age, and he smiled. "My stunning Florence, age really is just a number, is it not? We have proven that." They sat by the creek until the sun began to sink low in the sky, and then they made their slow way back to the house. That night, Preston slept peacefully in Florence's arms, and when he woke the next morning, he seemed stronger, more like himself. He lived for 3 more years, years filled with quiet joy and the love of his family. He saw his oldest grandson graduate from college, saw Margaret's paintings featured in a prominent New York gallery, saw 2 more great-grandchildren born. And through it all, Florence was by his side, loving him with every fiber of her being. When Preston finally passed, it was peacefully in his sleep with Florence holding his hand. She grieved deeply, but there was also gratitude in her grief. Gratitude for the decades they had shared, for the love that had sustained them both, for the life they had built together. Florence lived for another 8 years after Preston died, surrounded by her family and the legacy they had created together. She remained sharp and active until the very end, still keeping the ranch books, still tending her garden, still watching the sunset from the porch each evening. When her time came, she went peacefully, slipping away in her sleep just as Preston had. She was 83 years old, and she had lived a life richer and fuller than she had ever imagined possible. At her funeral, William stood before the gathered crowd and spoke about his mother with love and pride. He told the story of how she had come to Montana as a mail-order bride, terrified and convinced she would be rejected. He told how his father had looked at her and said that age was just a number, and that she was stunning. And he told how that moment of grace and acceptance had been the beginning of a love story that had shaped all their lives. "My parents taught me that love is not about perfection," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is about seeing someone for who they truly are and loving them anyway. It is about choosing each other every single day through good times and bad." They built a legacy not just of land and cattle, but of love and family and faith. And that legacy will live on in all of us. Florence and Preston were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath a sky so big and blue it seemed to go on forever. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names and the dates of their births and deaths, and one line beneath, "Together always." And in the years that followed, their descendants would often visit that hilltop, bringing flowers and telling stories about the grandmother who had been brave enough to lie about her age for a chance at love, and the grandfather who had seen past the lie to the beautiful woman beneath. They would talk about how one moment of kindness had changed everything, how one decision to give someone a chance had created a family that now numbered in the dozens. The ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations, a testament to what Preston and Florence had built. And though the world continued to change, though Montana evolved from a rough frontier territory to a modern state, the story of their love remained constant, a reminder that it is never too late for a second chance, never too late to find happiness, never too late to be seen and loved for who you truly are. Age is just a number, Preston had said all those years ago, and Florence had proven him right. She had lived a life that was full and rich and meaningful, a life that had started with fear and desperation and blossomed into joy and love and family. She had taken a leap of faith, and it had carried her farther than she ever could have imagined. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Florence and Preston were together again, dancing beneath the stars, their love eternal and unchanging. They had found each other against all odds, and not even death could separate them. They were together always, just as the headstone promised, bound by a love that had started with a lie but had become the truest thing either of them had ever known. Their story became legend in Jamestown, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But those who had known them, who had seen the way Preston looked at Florence and the way she smiled at him, knew that the legend was nothing compared to the reality. The reality was better, richer, more complex and beautiful than any story could capture. It was a love built on honesty after dishonesty, on acceptance after fear, on hope after despair. It was a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. It was a love that had created a family, built a legacy, and changed countless lives. And it all started with a terrified woman stepping off a stagecoach and a kind man who looked at her and said the words she needed to hear. "Age is just a number. You are stunning." Those words had been a gift, an offering of grace when grace was needed most. And Florence had accepted that gift and transformed it into something magnificent, proving that sometimes the best things in life come when we are brave enough to take a chance, to be vulnerable, to hope even when hope seems foolish. The Hall family flourished for generations, each new member carrying forward the legacy of love and acceptance that Preston and Florence had established. The ranch remained in the family, growing and changing with the times but never losing its essential character as a place of hard work, family values, and enduring love. And on warm summer evenings, when the sun set over the Montana mountains in a blaze of color, you could almost see them there on the porch, an old man and an old woman holding hands and watching the day fade into night. You could almost hear their laughter, almost feel the warmth of their love radiating out like heat from a fire. They were gone, but they were not forgotten. They lived on in every descendant who chose love over fear, who saw past surface appearances to the person beneath, who believed that it was never too late for happiness. They lived on in the very bones of the ranch, in the land they had tended and loved, in the house they had filled with laughter and family. Florence Thompson Hall had stepped off a stagecoach in 1882, expecting rejection, and had instead found the love of her life. She had been 42 years old and terrified, convinced that her age disqualified her from happiness. But Preston had shown her differently. He had shown her that love sees past numbers and wrinkles and gray hair to the soul beneath. He had shown her that true love is not about perfection, but about acceptance, not about youth, but about compatibility and respect and genuine affection. And in doing so, he had given her not just a home but a life, not just security but joy, not just companionship but a love that would echo through the generations, a love that would inspire countless others to take their own chances, to be brave, to believe in the possibility of second chances and new beginnings. This was the true legacy of Preston and Florence Hall, not the ranch or the money or the land, but the love they had shared and the example they had set. They had proven that it is never too late, that age truly is just a number, that stunning is a quality of spirit rather than youth, and that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, when we are brave enough to be vulnerable, honest enough to admit our fears, and open enough to accept grace when it is offered. Their love story was not a fairy tale. It was real and messy and complicated and beautiful, filled with hard work and sacrifice, and the daily choice to love each other even when it was difficult. But it was also transcendent, transformative, a testament to the power of kindness and acceptance, and seeing people for who they truly are. And so their story lived on, told around dinner tables and whispered at weddings, a reminder that love can bloom at any age, in any circumstance, if we are brave enough to reach for it and wise enough to nurture it when it comes. Florence and Preston had reached for each other across the barriers of expectation and fear, and they had built something beautiful that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love that would ripple out through time, touching lives they would never know, inspiring hope in hearts that had given up on second chances. In the end, that was their greatest gift, the proof that it is never too late, that love sees past the surface to the soul, and that sometimes the words we most need to hear are the simplest ones. Age is just a number. You are stunning. And in those words, a life was transformed, a love was born, and a legacy was created that would endure for generations. A shining example of what is possible when two people choose each other, not out of desperation or convenience, but out of genuine recognition and respect, and the kind of love that sees beauty where others might see only age or imperfection. Florence and Preston Hall had lived and loved and left behind something precious. The knowledge that we are all worthy of love, regardless of our age or our past, or our mistakes. They had shown that grace and acceptance can transform lives, that kindness costs nothing but gives everything, and that the best love stories are the ones written by ordinary people who make the extraordinary choice to truly see each other and love what they find. This was their story, their gift, their legacy. and it would live on forever in the hearts of those who knew it, a beacon of hope and a testament to the enduring power of love.